The cabin lights dimmed as we reached cruising altitude, and I finally let myself breathe. 20 years of service, countless missions in shadows where most men fear to tread, and it was over. My daughter's crayon drawing was folded in my pocket. A stick-figure dad with oversized arms she labeled my hero. In 6 hours, I'd walk through our front door for good, trading war zones for school plays. The flight attendant smiled as she passed, oblivious to the 3 men in row 12 who'd been too calm, too watchful. Old habits whispered warnings I tried to silence. This was supposed to be the flight that carried me home to peace. The cockpit door exploded open with a crack that silenced 200 conversations at once. 3 masked figures stormed forward, weapons glinting under fluorescent lights, their Arabic commands cutting through the sudden vacuum of shock. Passengers screamed as the lead terrorist dragged the captain into the aisle, his uniform disheveled and eyes wide with the terrible knowledge of what came next. 2 shots rang out, execution-style, professional and merciless. The co-pilot never made it past the threshold before he collapsed, crimson spreading across navy blue fabric. Every instinct in my body screamed to move, to act, to neutralize the threat within seconds like I'd been trained. But I forced my hands to tremble, my eyes to widen with manufactured terror, becoming just another frightened passenger in seat 14C. The lead terrorist's voice boomed through the cabin, accented but clear, promising death to anyone who resisted. His partners moved with military precision, confiscating phones and forcing heads down between knees. I studied their patterns through lowered lashes, the way the youngest favored his right side, how the tall one checked his watch every 43 seconds, where their attention wavered. My breathing stayed shallow and panicked, the perfect mask of helplessness. A woman sobbed 2 rows ahead, her child clutching a stuffed rabbit that reminded me painfully of home. The plane banked sharply left, autopilot, disengaged, and I knew with cold certainty that these men intended to write our obituaries in flames and twisted metal. The youngest terrorist paced the aisle like a caged predator, his AK-47 sweeping across rows of bowed heads with the jerky movements of inexperience. I catalogued every detail while keeping my shoulders hunched, my breathing ragged, the loose grip on his weapon, the way his eyes darted to the cockpit door for reassurance, the slight limp that suggested an old injury to his left knee. Through my peripheral vision, I watched the tall one near the emergency exit checking coordinates on a handheld device, his jaw clenched with the kind of focus that came from counting down to something final. The lead terrorist remained forward, barking orders in Arabic to his companions, while occasionally addressing us in English, painting vivid pictures of our approaching fate. 20 years of hunting men in darkness had taught me that fear makes people predictable, and these 3 were performing a rehearsed symphony of terror. My phone buzzed silently in my jacket pocket, 3 short pulses against my ribs that broke protocol for this flight mode prison we inhabited. I risked the smallest movement, letting my trembling hands fumble toward my chest as if clutching my heart in panic. The screen glowed beneath the fabric, a notification from Willowbrook Elementary, Emma's school, marked urgent with a red icon that sent ice through my veins. Your daughter has been transported to County Medical following an incident. Please contact immediately. 6 years old, her gap-toothed smile frozen in my wallet photo, and I was 37,000 feet from her with armed men, turning this aircraft into a guided missile. The terror I'd been performing became suddenly viciously real. The cabin tilted further as mountains appeared through the windows, jagged peaks reaching up like teeth, waiting to tear aluminum and flesh into unrecognizable pieces. A businessman across the aisle vomited into the seat pocket, the acrid smell mixing with sweat and recycled air thick with desperation. The youngest terrorist struck an elderly man who raised his head too high, the rifle butt connecting with sickening force that made the victim's wife wail. I absorbed it all through the filter of tactical assessment, but beneath the operator's cold calculation, a father's heart hammered against my sternum with primal urgency. Emma needed me. And these men stood between us with their fingers on triggers and delusions of martyrdom. My muscles coiled beneath manufactured helplessness, waiting for the moment when the predator would stop pretending to be prey. My thumb trembled against the phone screen, not from the performance I'd been delivering, but from genuine terror as I opened the text thread. There was a photo, Emma's classroom floor scattered with art supplies, a small handprint in spilled paint, and a message from Vice Principal Morrison that made my throat constrict. Your daughter collapsed during reading circle. Paramedics transported her with possible head trauma. She's asking for you. The words blurred as the cabin shook with turbulence, metal groaning like a dying beast, while passengers sobbed prayers in a dozen languages. 23 confirmed kills across 4 continents, and I'd never felt this helpless. The lead terrorist moved down the aisle, his boots heavy on carpet that muffled what should have been warning footsteps. I forced my attention away from the screen, letting my face crumble into the mask of a broken man, while every nerve fired with combat readiness beneath the surface. He stopped at my row, his shadow falling across me like a judgment, and spoke in accented English that dripped with satisfaction. You pray to your God now, yes? You think of family you leave behind. His breath carried cigarettes and certainty as he leaned closer, weapon barrel cold against my temple. I nodded, letting tears gather that were entirely real, my voice cracking when I whispered about my daughter waiting for her daddy to come home. He laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and moved on to terrorize the rows behind me. The moment his attention shifted, I committed everything to memory with the photographic recall that kept me alive through Kandahar and Fallujah. The Young Ones magazine sat loose in its housing, 2 seconds to jam if struck correctly. The tall one near the exit favored his right side, protecting old damage that would fold him with precise pressure. The leader carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already written, the most dangerous kind of opponent because faith made him careless. Emma's face floated behind my closed eyelids, her butterfly pajamas, her terrible knock-knock jokes, the way she held my hand crossing streets. I would see her again. These men had turned this aircraft into my battlefield, and battlefields were where I'd spent 2 decades, becoming something more efficient than human. My breathing steadied into the rhythm my instructor had beaten into me during selection, the calm that descended when violence became inevitable. The phone buzzed again, her doctor requesting Guardian contact, and I felt the last restraints of civilized behavior fall away like shed skin. The young terrorist with the loose magazine passed my row for the 3rd time in 14 minutes, his pattern now burned into my tactical map like coordinates. I rose slowly, clutching my stomach and letting my face go pale, playing the airsick passenger, stumbling toward the lavatory while my muscles coiled with lethal intent beneath trembling hands. He barely glanced my way, weapon lowered slightly as I lurched past him, and that moment of dismissal cost him everything. My elbow drove into his throat with surgical precision, crushing his windpipe before sound could form, and I caught both him and his weapon in one fluid motion that years of close-quarters training had made instinctive as breathing. The tall one spun toward the commotion, and I was already moving, using the first man's collapse as cover while I closed the distance between us. 3 seconds. That's all the chaos needed before passengers understood what was happening. And someone screamed. The tall terrorist's eyes widened as I struck his damaged side, feeling ribs that had healed wrong give way beneath my palm strike, and he folded exactly as predicted while I stripped his weapon mid-fall. The 3rd guard near the galley raised his rifle, but muscle memory from 1,000 range hours put 2 rounds center mass before conscious thought caught up with action, the sound deafening in the confined space, but necessary, final, absolute. Passengers dropped to the floor as I'd shouted, their survival instincts overriding panic, and for 5 heartbeats I thought we'd won, that Emma's face would be the next thing I saw in person rather than on a screen growing, cold with unanswered messages. Then the leader's voice crackled through the intercom, calm as Sunday morning, each word landing like a death sentence. "Very impressive, soldier. Yes, I know what you are. But while you played hero, I locked the cockpit and programmed our descent." The aircraft lurched, nose dipping forward with stomach dropping. Certainty. And through the cockpit door's reinforced glass, I could see him standing over the controls, blood spreading across his shoulder from where he'd been hit. "We have 12 minutes before these mountains become our grave. The door will take you 10 to breach, and you'll find I've disabled the override protocols your airline thinks are so secure." I pressed against the door, feeling its industrial strength mocking my desperation, while passengers began screaming again, their brief hope curdling into something worse than the original terror. My phone buzzed against my chest. Emma's number, probably the hospital using her contacts, and I realized with crystalline horror that survival had just become vastly more complicated than neutralizing armed men. The mathematics of catastrophe scrolled through my mind. 12 minutes, reinforced barriers, a dying man with nothing to lose, and my daughter's face waiting on a screen I might never unlock again. I slammed the rifle butt against the cockpit door's hinges with methodical fury, each impact sending shockwaves through my forearms while precious seconds dissolved into nothing. The reinforced steel barely dented, mocking my desperation as the altimeter numbers visible through the small window dropped with nightmare velocity. Behind me, a woman's voice cut through the chaos, steady and commanding despite the pandemonium. "Stop wasting time breaking it. Use the emergency axe from the galley and aim for the locking mechanism, not the hinges." I spun to find a flight attendant in her 60s, grey hair pulled back tight, her hands already moving with practiced efficiency to clear panicking passengers from the aisle. The axe felt primitive in my hands after years of advanced weaponry, but I followed her direction, driving the blade into the narrow gap between door and frame, where the electronic lock nested behind thin composite material. Metal shrieked as I pried and struck, my shoulders burning while the aircraft's angle steepened and overhead compartments began popping open, raining luggage onto screaming passengers. "I'm Sandra, 30 years with the airline, 10 as a flight simulator instructor before I retired," the woman said, positioning herself beside the door like she was preparing for surgery. "When you get through, don't touch anything until I tell you exactly what to do, understood?" Her calm felt surreal against the countdown playing in my skull. 8 minutes now, maybe less. The lock mechanism finally surrendered with a metallic snap that sounded like salvation, and I kicked the door inward to find the terrorist leader slumped against the pilot's chair, blood pooling beneath him as his eyes tracked my entrance with fading awareness. The control panel before me looked like alien technology, hundreds of switches and screens displaying information I couldn't decode, while the artificial horizon showed our nose pointed at angles that meant death. "The autopilot's engaged in a dive program," Sandra called from behind me, squeezing into the cramped space. "That red switch overhead, flip it now, then pull. Back on the yoke, gently, or you'll rip the wings off at this speed." My hand moved to obey, but the dying man's lips curled into something resembling a smile, words bubbling through blood-flecked teeth. "The code you need isn't for the plane, soldier. It's for the address where your daughter is right now, and it dies with me in exactly 4 breaths." His eyes held mine with terrible clarity, and I froze between the controls that could save 147 souls and the truth that could save the only soul that mattered, time fracturing into an impossible choice that no training had prepared me to make. Sandra's hand clamped onto my wrist with surprising strength, yanking my focus from the terrorist's dying eyes to her weathered face that held no room for hesitation. "He's gone in 30 seconds regardless, but we die in 7 minutes if you don't listen to me right now," she commanded, her voice cutting through the screaming in my head about my daughter and the impossible mathematics of this moment. I felt my body split between 2 realities. the father who would burn the world for his child, and the operator trained to prioritize mission success over personal cost. Her other hand was already moving across the instrument panel, fingers hovering over switches as she read the chaos of blinking warnings with practice fluency. Disengage the autopilot with that. Red guard switch. Then I need you to pull the yoke back exactly 3 inches when I say not before, not more, she instructed, while my vision tunneled and the terrorists' labored breathing counted down behind us. The plane shuddered violently, and something in the cargo hold broke loose with a thunderous crash that sent passengers into fresh hysterics. I made my choice by forcing my hand upward, flipping the switch that severed the autopilot's death grip, and the controls suddenly fought against me like living things as wind resistance tried to maintain our terminal dive. Now pull. Steady pressure. Think of lifting a sleeping child, Sandra coached, her voice becoming my anchor as the yoke resisted, with forces that strained every muscle in my back and shoulders. The nose began rising with agonizing slowness, while the altimeter continued its nightmare descent, mountains visible through the windscreen like jagged teeth waiting to chew us into oblivion. Behind me I heard the terrorists' final exhale, that precious code, dissolving into death, and my heart shattered even as my hands kept working, because stopping now meant everyone dies, including any chance of reaching her. Sandra's fingers danced across throttle controls, adjusting engine power with the confidence of someone who'd lived 10,000 scenarios in simulators and knew that panic killed faster than any mechanical failure. The artificial horizon slowly crawled toward level as G-forces pressed us deep into seats, passengers experiencing the physics of salvation without understanding how close the margin remained. Altitude stabilizing, but we've got another problem, Sandra announced, tapping a fuel gauge that showed reserves dropping into critical ranges. My daughter's face burned in my mind like a photograph held too close to flame, but my hands stayed true to Sandra's instructions because she'd given me the only path forward that didn't guarantee failure. There's a regional airfield 16 miles northwest. You're going to land this aircraft there, and then you're going to save your little girl, she said with absolute certainty, as if she could command reality itself. The terrorist's hand twitched against the blood-soaked cockpit floor, his lips moving with the desperate urgency of a dying confession, and I dropped to my knees beside him despite every instinct screaming to stay focused on the controls. Sandra now commanded alone. His fingers clutched at my flight suit, pulling me close enough to smell the copper tang of his blood mixing with aviation fuel, and his eyes held something worse than hatred. They held victory. The code, he whispered through bubbling breaths that sprayed red across my face, wasn't for the autopilot, American. My heart stopped as his words carved through my chest like broken glass, each syllable destroying the fragile hope I'd built around saving these people and reaching my daughter in time. 627 Meridian Court. That's where she is right now, waiting for news that Daddy's plane scattered across a mountain because you chose strangers over blood. The cockpit tilted as Sandra fought to maintain our tenuous climb, warnings still screaming from every instrument, but the entire aircraft faded into background static against the roaring in my skull that threatened to split my sanity down the middle. I grabbed the terrorist's collar, lifting his dying weight as rage and terror fused into something that had no name in any language I'd ever spoken in war zones across 3 continents. If you're lying, if this is another layer of your game, I swear I'll find your family, your legacy, everyone you ever loved. I snarled with a darkness that surprised even me, but his smile only widened with blood-stained teeth. He coughed wetly, his body convulsing as organs failed in sequence, and his final words emerged with the clarity of someone who'd rehearsed this moment in dreams. My brother died whispering your name. Now you'll live whispering hers, wondering if choosing these sheep cost you the only lamb that mattered. His hand fell away as life drained from eyes that stayed open, locked on mine with that terrible smile, and I lurched backward into Sandra's legs as she stood between the pilot seats, maintaining impossible equilibrium. "What did he say?" she demanded, without looking away from the windscreen where the regional airfield appeared like a distant postage stamp against brown wilderness, but I couldn't force words through the crushing weight compressing my chest. My phone burned in my pocket with that hospital photograph, my daughter's face small and frightened in a bed surrounded by machines, and now an address that might be truth or final torture from a man who'd orchestrated this nightmare. Sandra's voice cut through again, sharper. "I need you present. I need you here. Or we die in 3 minutes when I run out of altitude and ideas." I pushed myself upright on legs that felt borrowed from someone else's body, compartmentalizing the terror into a locked box, the way instructors had taught in rooms designed to break human spirits into useful weapons. "Fly this plane, save these people, I'll handle what comes after." I managed through a throat that tasted like ashes and broken promises, knowing that landing successfully might be the beginning of an even darker descent. My hands returned to the yoke as Sandra called out airspeed and approach angles. But part of my soul was already 16 miles beyond this cockpit, racing toward an address that held either my daughter or the final piece of a dead man's revenge. The airfield rushed up through the windscreen like a judgment as Sandra's voice counted down our final seconds, her words clipping through decades of muscle memory I'd never earned in a cockpit, and my hands moved across controls that felt like extensions of pure desperation rather than trained skill. The runway stretched ahead impossibly narrow, a strip of cracked asphalt carved between wilderness that had witnessed 1,000 safe landings, but never one piloted by a man whose world was simultaneously expanding and collapsing into a singularity of terror. Metal groaned as Sandra talked me through the flare, that crucial moment when everything either worked or converted into statistics and debris fields, and I felt the gear kiss concrete with a jarring impact that sent coffee cups and magazines airborne throughout the cabin behind us. We bounced once, twice, my overcorrection nearly sending us careening into the brush before Sandra's hands covered mine on the yoke, steadying us through the ground roll as reverse thrust screamed and passengers wept with the kind of relief that follows miracles they'd never expected to witness. Emergency vehicles converged from every direction as we finally shuddered to a halt halfway down the runway, their lights painting the interior in alternating red and white that felt like accusation rather than rescue, and I was already unbuckling before the aircraft fully stopped moving. Sandra grabbed my wrist with surprising strength, her eyes reading everything I hadn't said about that final conversation with the dying terrorist. And her question came loaded with understanding. "There's something else, isn't there?" I met her. Gaze for a heartbeat that contained entire conversations about duty and sacrifice, and the impossible mathematics of choosing between saving strangers and protecting your own blood. "I saved 147 lives today, but if I lost the one that gave mine meaning, then what exactly did I win?" The words emerged raw and unfiltered as sirens wailed their approach, and Sandra's expression shifted into something that looked like recognition of a pain she'd perhaps carried herself through different circumstances. The cabin door blew open to a chaos of first responders and sobbing passengers who reached for me with gratitude I couldn't absorb, their words of heroism and salvation sliding off armor I'd welded around the growing dread in my chest. I pushed through the crowd with apologies that felt hollow against their attempts to embrace the man who delivered them from death, but my phone was already out, that address burning across the screen like coordinates to either salvation or damnation. Someone official tried to stop me at the exit, demanding statements and documentation. But whatever they saw in my face made them step aside as I descended the stairs into mountain air that smelled like aviation fuel and pine and the metallic tang of destiny fulfilled or destroyed. My feet hit tarmac as the full weight crashed through every defense I'd maintained. This entire Nightmare had been choreographed around my presence, my skills, my specific history bleeding into present consequences. The terrorist's brother had died years ago under my crosshairs in operations I'd filed away as necessary actions in an endless war. But revenge doesn't follow operational guidelines or expire with mission debriefs. He'd researched, planned, and executed an elaborate trap that turned my final flight home into a public stage for private vengeance, and my daughter was never collateral damage. She was always the primary target. Standing there while emergency crews swarmed the aircraft I'd barely landed, I understood with crystalline clarity that saving this plane was never about heroism. It was about forcing me to choose between anonymous lives and the one life that contained my entire universe, then living forever with whatever choice I made. The rental car's engine roared to life beneath my trembling hands as federal agents shouted behind me, their demands for statements and debriefs dissolving into background noise against the singular frequency of paternal terror that drowned out everything else. Sandra appeared at my window one final time, pressing a piece of paper against the glass with a phone number and 3 words scrawled beneath it, for after everything. I nodded without speaking, because language had abandoned me somewhere between landing that plane and understanding the full architecture of the revenge that had been constructed around my family. Then I was accelerating away from the airfield with gravel spraying and officials scrambling for vehicles they'd never catch. The address glowed in my mind like a brand as mountains blurred past, each mile collapsing the distance. Between my present location and the coordinates where my daughter's fate waited in whatever condition this elaborate vengeance had orchestrated. My phone revealed the truth in fragments as I drove with one hand and scrolled through encrypted files with the other, security clearances I still maintained opening doors into classified after-action. Reports from years buried beneath operational silence. There he was in mission photographs I'd nearly forgotten, Khalid Hassan, the younger brother watching from doorways, while I'd eliminated his older sibling during a raid that command had classified as textbook precision. The images showed a boy of maybe 15, whose eyes already contained the kind of hatred that doesn't fade with time, but ferments into obsession, and subsequent intelligence reports tracked his transformation from traumatized witness to calculated architect of this entire scenario. He'd spent years studying me, learning about my transition out of active service, discovering my daughter's existence, then constructing this airborne theater specifically designed to destroy me psychologically before ending my bloodline as payment for ending his. The tactical part of my brain that never fully disengaged even in civilian life assembled the pattern with cold clarity. He'd needed me on that specific flight, needed the expertise that would allow me to potentially save. Those passengers needed the phone call about my daughter to arrive at precisely the moment that would fracture my focus. Every element had been engineered to create impossible choices: save strangers or save family, land the plane or race to her location, be the hero to hundreds while failing the one person whose existence defined my purpose. This wasn't random terrorism or political statement. This was Shakespeare written in blood and altitude, revenge dressed in tactical gear, and recited through screaming passengers who never knew they were extras in someone else's vengeance play. I pressed the accelerator harder as city limits materialized ahead, the address pulling me forward like gravity toward a collision I couldn't avoid, only survive or be destroyed by, when I finally discovered what waited at those coordinates. My daughter's face filled my mind, her gap-toothed smile at breakfast before I'd left for that final mission, her voice on our last call saying she'd made me a welcome home card, her absolute faith that Daddy always came back no matter what. Khalid had understood that killing her would be insufficient revenge. He'd needed me to live afterward, to carry the weight of those 147 saved lives against the one lost life that mattered more than my own existence, creating a math problem with no solution except eternal torment. The warehouse. Address materialized through sheets of rain as the most unremarkable building imaginable, its corrugated metal exterior revealing nothing of the horror I'd constructed in my imagination during every mile of that desperate drive. I killed the engine 2 blocks away and approached on foot with muscle memory overriding conscious thought. My body, remembering room-clearing procedures that civilian life had never truly erased from the fiber of who I was beneath the surface. But halfway across the parking lot, I registered the vehicles arranged in defensive positions, government plates, tactical markings, the unmistakable signature of operators who knew what they were doing. Then the side door opened, and Jackson emerged, with his hands visible and empty, my former team leader, whose face I hadn't seen since my discharge, and behind him the entire constellation of brothers who'd once moved through darkness with me like extensions of the same weapon system. "She's inside," Jackson said before I could speak, his voice carrying that same steady calm that had talked me through firefights in places whose names remained classified. "We intercepted the secondary team 6 hours ago when CIA flagged unusual chatter connecting your flight to historical targets. Took us 90 minutes to track the connection to your family and establish containment here." He stepped aside as emotion tried to climb my throat and strangle whatever words might have existed, gesturing toward the doorway where warm light spilled into rain-soaked darkness. I moved past him on legs that suddenly remembered how exhaustion felt after adrenaline burned away, entering a space that had been transformed from whatever industrial purpose it once served into an impromptu command center where my daughter sat wrapped in someone's tactical jacket, her small face illuminated by laptop screens and radio equipment. "Daddy!" Her voice shattered something fundamental in my chest as she launched herself across the room, her 6-year-old body colliding with mine with enough force to make me stagger backward into Jackson's steadying hand. I dropped to my knees because standing suddenly seemed impossible, wrapping my arms around her with a grip that might have been too tight except she was squeezing back just as desperately, her words tumbling out about the nice soldiers who'd picked her up from school and let her talk on real military radios and promised her I was coming. My hands moved across her hair and shoulders with the frantic inventory of someone confirming reality against nightmare, checking for injuries that didn't exist, seeking evidence of trauma in a child who somehow thought this had been an adventure, because these men had shielded her from understanding the machinery of death that had been pointed at her existence. "I knew you'd make it, Daddy," she whispered against my neck with absolute conviction that carved through every defense I'd constructed across years of operational compartmentalization, and suddenly I was crying in front of my former team in ways that combat had never managed to break me. The tears carried everything I'd suppressed during that impossible landing and desperate drive, washing away the tactical operator to reveal only a father holding his daughter in a warehouse that smelled of rain and gun oil, surrounded by men who'd saved the one thing that mattered more than the 147 lives I'd rescued at 30,000 feet. Did you feel his moment of breaking as powerfully as he did? Subscribe to experience more stories that reach into the deepest parts of what makes us human.